Hello everyone, my name is Samantha McCaughren and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest RDS Vision 2030 web series. Now typically this would be in front of a live audience, a very live conversation, but we've all had to make a lot of changes this year, both personally and professionally, and the series is no different. Though better known as a venue, the RDS mission is to see Ireland thrive both culturally and economically, as it has been for nearly 300 years. And today, one way the Society continues this work is through sharing insights and ideas to help build a more sustainable future for Ireland. Now today I'm delighted to welcome our panellists. I'm joined by Professor Ed Sweeney, originally from Wexford, but Professor of Logistics and Systems at Aston University, Birmingham, and John McGrane, Managing Director of the British-Irish Chamber of Commerce. Now, COVID-19 has understandably dominated the public discourse and our minds for the last few months, but Brexit is very much re-emerging as one of the main topics that we should be concerned about. Potentially, we'll have to deal with the consequences of Brexit sooner rather than later. And what does this mean for imports, exports? What are the specific challenges faced by the sector from COVID and the pandemic? Companies and the economy is going to be struggling probably from the two simultaneously. And then with this all taking up so much of our thinking, how does that leave Ireland for longer term issues like commitments for the green agenda and climate change? So Ed, I'll start with you. I'm just wondering, how prepared is Ireland and its transport sector for a hard Brexit?
Thank you for your introduction. That's an excellent question. I think it's a very difficult question to answer on many levels. The first big uncertainty, of course, is we know that Brexit's going to happen at the end of this year, but we still don't know exactly what that Brexit will look like. So your question referred to a no-deal Brexit. I think we've got to look at this in the wider context. The situation we have now is one where we've got, pretty much frictionless trade between Ireland, the UK, and the rest of the European Union. Whatever kind of Brexit we end up with will involve more friction, and therefore will be less favourable. I think the closer it is to a no-deal Brexit, the closer it is to a hard Brexit, the more that friction will be. But the biggest single problem to me as I sit here in July 2020 is we still don't know exactly what the situation will be when the transition period ends later this year. And it's only a few months away. And this is a slightly worrying piece. The other piece which relates to that is, and you asked specifically in your question about the transport sector, what we have to remember about the transport, and particularly the freight, transportation and logistics sector, is that it's absolutely at the vanguard of this whole sort of issue. And it's a sector which is an interesting sector because it's a very fragmented sector in the sense that we have a relatively small number of big players, and those players are probably more likely to be able to weather this storm in some kind of reasonable fashion. But the vast majority of companies in this sector are small companies. And they are small companies that typically are operating, in any case, with relatively tight profit margins, probably with a fairly narrow, what we call innovation bandwidth. So they're going to really struggle to cope with any kind of Brexit, and particularly a Brexit of the hard variety. The final thing I'll say about that initially is that it's the uncertainty again. I think we have a lot of evidence, and we see evidence of this in the UK as well, that the uncertainty is causing investment decision making to be slowed down. So a lot of companies are kind of waiting to see what will happen before investing in productive capability. And that in turn is rendering a lot of key elements of many supply chains across many sectors quite fragile competitively. So lots to worry about, I think.
And John, how do you feel your members are in terms of preparedness? COVID has probably taken up a huge amount of resource, energy, time and finances. So where do you feel members are in terms of being prepared and ready for what may come in the next few months?
Well, thanks, Samantha, and thanks to the ODS for hosting. I guess the profile of preparedness mirrors some of the points that Ed has been making. At the very largest end of the industrial market, the big players, and particularly those in highly regulated sectors like pharmaceuticals, clearly in financial services, but in the goods area, some of the very big food players, they would be well prepared now at this stage because they have to be. It doesn't mean that it's not a burden on them. It's an extraordinarily high burden in terms of cost and resources that could and should be applied to more productive things, but it is what it is. At the middle end of the market, we might come to that, but at the smaller end of the market, actually perversely, where lots and lots of small firms, just as lots and lots of small logistics firms, as Ed points to, lots and lots of small firms, say in food, clearly they're not prepared. They don't have the time, the money, or the bandwidth to devote to preparing for something that nobody can tell them what it is. And there are so many possible outcomes still at this late stage. They should be prepared, they're not, but they'll have a greater flexibility to catch up with what emerges whenever that comes. Our biggest worry is actually mid-scale firms. And Ireland has a lot of very fine, many of them household name, mid-scale, often family-owned food producers and food processors and food sellers that sell from Ireland. Part of the 80% of what we make that we don't eat in food, half of which is sold to and eaten by UK customers who hugely value that product. A lot of those firms don't have the global scale to digest this financially, and they're too big to turn on a dime like a small mom-and-pop family-based operation. We worry about those firms. They too don't know what they have to be prepared for in detail, and their business model in many cases depends hugely on the highly sophisticated logistics of getting food from a factory in North Dublin or Monaghan over on a truck across the Irish Sea and onto a Marks & Spencer shelf by 8:10 tomorrow morning. That works extraordinarily well to the benefit of everybody in literally the food chain. Those firms are at risk.
We've heard a lot about Dover as an example, 2-minute checks becoming 20-minute checks, tailbacks, etc. How prepared are we in this island in terms of our ports, our airports, our seaports for the changes and the bureaucracy that may come with the Brexit actually happening?
That's a good question. I think to reflect back on some of the points John made, I think levels of preparedness differ depending on the sort of sector we're dealing with, depending on which part of the supply chain we're looking at. Being based in the UK, I've been watching very closely, particularly what's been happening in Dover. And it's very concerning, really, because we still see, just 5 months away from the end of the transition period, a lot of uncertainty about what the new Dover, the new normal in Dover will look like. By contrast, if we look at Calais across the channel, we see generally a much higher level of preparedness, where live testing of new infrastructure has been carried out. But that contrasts quite sharply with what we've seen on the UK side. So I think, to coin a phrase, a lot done, yes, but a lot more to do. And exactly what that lot more to do looks like, we're not sure about. So again, it's back to this issue of the uncertainty is causing a sense of, well, look, let's wait and see before investing huge amounts of money in new capability and infrastructure. So that's a slight concern I have. Now, of course, if we have deficiencies or weaknesses or fragility in some of that infrastructure, that potentially has a knock-on effect right back through the whole supply chain. And I mean, going back to a point John made, which I think is a really important one, the SMEs, the smaller end of the SMEs tend to be very agile. That's their business model. Some of the large companies do have the financially deep pockets to really to kind of come out the other end of this in some kind of reasonable shape. But I echo exactly what John said, that there's a mid-range of companies across. We see it in retail, we see it in manufacturing, but we see it also in the logistics service provision business. And going back to something I said before, it's that third-party logistics industry that very often is the direct interface with the ports and the airports. And the other elements of the kind of trading infrastructure. So they're seeing firsthand where these deficiencies are. So it's a mixed story, really, overall.
And the land bridge is a well-trodden path for tens of thousands of truck crossings from Ireland to the EU. And it is seen by some as the sort of the best way to get to Europe. But are there better alternatives, or should we be looking at new ways of doing it?
I think the reality is that we are. There always have been alternatives. I think what's important to think about in this context is often what's more important for a customer is not so much delivery lead times, So we can optimize delivery lead times by using the land bridge potentially, but often what's much more significant is the reliability of that, the consistency of that. Now, if using the land bridge means that delivery lead times become inconsistent, that makes alternatives much more attractive. So we've seen some indication of increased shipping routes, for example, happening directly to continental Europe as a way of avoiding the land bridge. But I think a lot will depend, again, on exactly what the trade deal looks like, exactly what kind of infrastructure will emerge in the UK and how efficient or otherwise that will be. So I think it would be really interesting in July 2021 to come back and to ask that same question again with the benefit of hindsight, because there is really so much uncertainty still in this mix.
Samantha, I'd add to what Ed is saying on that. It's a really significant issue for Ireland's unique physical trading space. I mean, we're an island behind a larger island of a continent. It takes 20 hours to get, say, food exports or other goods exports in a truck through the land bridge to the European market. It takes 40 hours if that is extended by roll-on, roll-off ferry to go directly to, say, northern France or thereabouts. And it takes 60 hours if it's on, load-off. So you're talking about, obviously Ed is right, if you can manage the delays and if it's a non-perishable product, that's one thing, but it's expensive. The services are far less fluent. There's a highly sophisticated corridor through the UK. And in fair to the authorities in Britain on this at the present time, the goodwill towards maintaining a through land bridge is there. But much of that even depends in its execution on things like permitting for drivers, on the differentiation between different types of licenses, larger players versus smaller players. So there's much to be worked out, and that's the piece of uncertainty that remains hanging over many Irish traders right now.
Some of the large companies I've spoken to in the food area, in their kind of worst case contingency planning, have seen maybe a very difficult initial few weeks, potentially the first few days being difficult. Would you be optimistic that that will be a short-term problem and that business, as we've seen with COVID-19, will be resilient, and that maybe in the shorter than we expect term, things will actually smooth themselves out?
That's a really good question, and I think businesses tend to be sort of resilient. They've got that sort of built into their DNA. The COVID situation, as you alluded to, has demonstrated that. I mean, for example, if we cast our minds back to a few months ago, just before the lockdown, we saw this incredible spike in demand, particularly for sort of food products. We had a situation in the UK in the middle of March where the biggest single warehouse was actually people's fridges and freezers and cupboards. We had about £1 billion worth of foodstuffs sitting in people's houses as a result of that sort of stockpiling and panic buying. Now, we can all remember back to that because the shelves in the supermarkets temporarily were short of certain products, and of course the ubiquitous toilet roll became emblematic of that whole period. But what to me was remarkable was that finely tuned food supply chain, within a matter of weeks, even days really, got back to a situation where it was able to cope with a completely different demand pattern. So if we think about demand for food products at the consumer end of the supply chain, it changed radically in a matter of weeks. So first of all, the food service industry effectively disappeared. So restaurants, bars, cafes, canteens and so on. So we saw a massive increase in demand for food in retail. And even within retail, we saw a big shift because there was a lot of evidence, for example, of convenience stores seeing much higher levels of demand. And of course, there was the big move to online shopping. I think one of my industry business partners in the UK, one of the big supermarket chains, moved from having a couple of 100,000 delivery slots for online shopping to having 750,000, literally in a matter of weeks. Now that was something they had planned to do, but over a matter of years.
Yeah.
So going back to your original question, I think business can be remarkably resilient when it needs to be. However, and the big however is, a lot of this is dependent upon the sort of context and the infrastructure and the general environment that companies operate in. And again, a lot of my answers seem to be coming back to the uncertainty which is still around.
It's been a feature for the last few years,
and,
yeah.
I think the general thrust of your question is right in the sense that companies will cope with what they have to cope with, but they will cope with it better if they have a bit of a lead-in period in terms of planning and investing in the capability they need. I mean, the other thing I just wanted to mention in this context, and I think is vitally important, is in the last few months, for someone like me, it's been fantastic because I'm privileged in the sense that I sort of study supply chains for a living, and we've seen the biggest single change probably ever in terms of how supply chains work and what they've had to react to. One of my business partners said to me it was like having, the period leading up to the lockdown was like having sort of 6 Christmases all at one time. But for Christmas, you know it's coming and you can plan for it. But with this, we couldn't. So it's been a remarkable learning experience. But the opportunity for us, I think, is the word logistics and the phrase supply chain is front and center in a lot of what we do at the moment. So I think as supply chain professionals now, what the last few months have demonstrated, on top of Brexit before that, is that, you know, efficient and effective supply chains are absolutely critical, not just to economic well-being, but to wider societal well-being. So one of the positive things I hope will emerge from this is that supply chain issues and freight transportation logistics issues will become centre stage in the public policy making arena, which they frankly haven't been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, John, you may have come across this. There can be a frustration sometimes that at a political level and at a policy level, there isn't an understanding of how business actually is done. Like, it is a very fragmented, supply chains and logistics are a very fragmented sector, as John was saying. I'm sure your members have had concerns like, how do I actually deal with this? And maybe it isn't really recognised at a more political level that that's a real issue for businesses.
Well, Ed is absolutely right about that, Samantha. The policy focus that's needed in this area is fundamental to how we come out of it. To be fair to the public servants who are behind the scenes, both in Ireland, in Britain and in Europe on this, if they didn't have to pay much attention to this a couple of years ago, they're certainly paying attention to it now. It's complex. I mean, there is no easy answer, and there's nothing can be magicked up. I mean, you're talking about moving to an environment where potentially, starting in January, Irish traders could end up having to complete, one way or another, whether in paper or online, 20 million additional returns and documents, effectively, to certify their trade. I mean, that's just an indigestible interruption, and it cannot be done. So one of the political realisms that is dawning is that this idea of a cliff edge on 31 December is so horrendous, and I think, you know, COVID has helped people to see what horrendous looks like, and I don't mean to be inappropriate in that, but you know what I mean. I mean, as Ed has rightly said, you know, all of those Christmases coming at the same time, not. The reality is people have been exposed to what happens when a highly developed, highly sophisticated system that's evolved over 40 years to the benefit of consumers, and they are voters, that they have seen that actually, why would we want to interrupt that to such a degree and put everything at hazard? And the other aspect in this is that it is all about consumers. So we inevitably talk in the trade side from the supply side, and the interruption and the hazards, and indeed the impact adversely on investment. Really important things. But watch what happens. In the last few weeks, British supermarkets, all of them now, have come out and said if the alternative to what we have is to bring in, shall we say, less attractive, less healthy food from some trade deal somewhere else, that's not what we want to sell our customers. There's a listening to the customer now that says the customer wants value, but they want safe, healthy food at the same time. So our instinct on this is that business will ultimately be guided by the consumer, and the consumer is a pretty smart individual, and possibly even smarter now at this point, given what we've gone through over the past 8 months.
Can I just come in on that point? Because I think looking at food retailing is very instructive at 2 levels. I mean, one, it reinforces that point which John has just made, that consumers will ultimately drive this, because consumers want, you know, good quality products in the right place at the right time and cost effectively. So that's absolutely right. Now, what's happened certainly in a UK context in recent months is we've seen a level of collaboration between competitor retail multiples, particularly in relation to logistics and supply chain issues, which simply was impossible previously. So I think there have been some really interesting elements of good practice that we've witnessed through the pandemic. What I've been saying to a lot of people is, when we begin to unlock from this, I think we're going to have a relatively short window of opportunity to really bed in some of these good practices, particularly around how different companies in different parts of the supply chain collaborate with each other. And the word collaboration is an important word to us in the supply chain profession. It's a word, unfortunately, which sometimes we pay a little bit of it falls into the lip service trap, if in the sense that if we talk about it for long enough, we begin to think we're doing it. But I have seen some real evidence of collaboration between competitors at the same point in the supply chain, but also collaboration upstream and downstream. So, for example, third-party logistics organizations collaborating much more tightly with shippers, with manufacturers, and with retail companies. And in my own world, in the university world, we've seen a big impetus behind business-university collaboration, because we see obvious examples of that in terms of the incredible search for a vaccine, where we see pharmaceutical companies working with labs in Oxford and Imperial College and all the rest of it. What we don't see as much, perhaps, is in our supply chain labs in universities. There's a kind of urgency about some of the work we're doing, which is aimed ultimately at trying to inject some more innovation into supply chains. So that kind of business academic collaboration and engagement, I think, has been given some impetus in the last few months as well.
In the last couple of years, we have seen some companies, some large grocery retail groups, for example, diverting their supply chain, actually moving to European suppliers to avoid dealing with some of the complexities that we've discussed about dealing with UK post-Brexit. John, do you think inevitably we're going to see less trade with Britain because of what's happening coming down the line for us?
No, frankly. The UK has 65 million people who still got to eat, still got to educate themselves, still got to take a holiday, still have to clothe themselves, still do all the human basics of life. They love Irish food. They eat half of our surplus, not because it's cheap, but because it's great food. It gives them everything that they need at a price they can afford. The logistics to distribute that, as Ed has been saying, are extraordinarily well developed. And so we give the customer what they want. And it's not just in food. It's our tourism product. It's our education product. In terms of the numbers of UK students studying in Irish universities, for instance. So while proportionally the amount of business that we do with the UK compared to the rest of the world will undoubtedly evolve. It's been evolving for the last 40 years because we are moving beyond, for language reasons and lots of other things, as we've equipped ourselves better. But the absolute volume of trade, no. We're the nearest market. We speak almost the same language. We have mostly the same laws and customs. We are, when we do fly, I can do a meeting in Oxford Street from my home in Donnybrook at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, quicker than I can get to do a meeting in Cork or Galway. These are the realities of the intertwining that we have amongst us. We've always traded, we always will. The only issue now is what value will be taken out of that trade, and that's ultimately about what jobs will not be invested in because the margin is less because of interruptions in the cost chain of the supply chain. So, look, there are huge opportunities still to do more trade, and if anything, Enterprise Ireland, for instance, acknowledges this. It's still our biggest market. It's our biggest two-way market for exports and imports. And not just in goods, we've talked a lot about goods, but the services side is a huge area of our intertwinement as well. But there are huge further opportunities to do business. It is the easiest market for an Irish firm which hasn't yet exported to start exporting to. And in an Ireland context, our well-being depends on us exporting because we have too small an indigenous market. The UK is right beside us. We need to think about how we help Irish firms to develop more business and more jobs for both islands because of that proximity.
We have a green hue to our government now, so the green agenda is firmly centre stage at the moment. Decarbonising transport is a big issue. How is that going to affect our import and export sector?
I think, let's put this in context. If we look at any supply chain, what we know is they do damage. Supply chain activities, upstream and downstream, do damage to the natural environment in the form of greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, noise, and so on. That's particularly the case when it comes to transportation activities. And this is a challenging one, because if we think about freight transportation and logistics, number one, it's been traditionally very, very dependent on road. And road in turn has been very heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on diesel. So it's been a stubborn sector in terms of trying to decarbonise. The other thing that's interesting is if we look at all of the projections over the next decade and beyond, they indicate that the logistics sector in terms of sort of ton kilometres will increase much more rapidly than the general level of economic activity, and the shape of that will change as well. So really the point is that business as usual is not an option, simply because if it is business as usual in transportation and logistics, it will mean that the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions coming from that sector just gets to a level which, excuse the pun, is completely unsustainable. So decarbonisation is going to be a key part of the agenda, no question about that. The fact that we have a green hue in the government, the fact that we have the European Union Green Deal will provide an impetus for that. My own sort of feeling, and this is based largely on quite a number of stakeholder engagement workshops I've been involved with recently here in Ireland, suggests to me that if we take the logistics service provision business, it accepts and it recognises that business as usual is not an option. So that raises the question, well, what is the future? Now, I think we've got to be very, very careful in this space, because there is no single magic solution or silver bullet or panacea for this. So what's likely going to happen is we're going to have a package of different types of measures and interventions. Some will be at firm level, so individual companies can do things to progress the agenda. For example, we work in my university in the UK on one European funded project, ironically, which is trying to help SMEs in the region become more low carbon. However, what we find, and we dole out some grants as part of that to help small companies to improve energy efficiency, for example. However, what we've learned from that is it is very limited what one company acting on its own can do. So I think there's a very widespread acceptance and recognition now that if we are going to achieve the sort of deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions that we need, it's going to require a lot of collaboration up and down the supply chain. So we're back to that magic concept of collaboration again, I think.
And there is, you know, to the policy sort of backdrop to all of this, as Ed describes, this is where government can do what only government can do. And we have a new government with a green hue to it, but it's not sort of, you know, emerald green, crystal clear. It's got hues of green within the green movement as well. So we need to have a conversation at policy level about which forms of decarbonisation the government wants to actually support. There are issues around green objection to certain forms of gas. So gas is a fossil fuel, but it's a transition energy for energy transition. We cannot get to where we want to be by eliminating gas today. We've already taken a political decision about a terminal on the island in the Midwest. We need to talk about clean gas. Not all gas is the same, but there is very clean gas available to us. We need to talk about clean hydrogen, which other countries, not least Britain, are at a very advanced stage of developing the technologies for safety around that area. And in trucking, in heavy trucking, talking about the logistics side, as Ed emphasises, the key to future decarbonisation of heavy trucking is actually hydrogen. The technology is well advanced and has more to go, but government can support that, and then industry will take it once it's stimulated.
And are you concerned that there's a huge focus on very immediate issues, COVID, Brexit, and then green? Is that going to be pushed down the line a little bit, maybe not given the priority it should be for?
I don't think we have the time to push it anywhere.
There's an acknowledgement that it is. Yeah.
This is clear and present, and you know, part of the national sentiment is to get on with this in a very healthy way for everybody involved. And so there's no marks for an administration that's confused or fighting within itself or are not taking a lead on this, actually, because the people want this, and the targets and the costs we've set ourselves if we don't reach those targets are unsustainable.
I totally agree. Can I just come in on that? I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, we've got something which is an existential threat. My own view is that we hear a lot about build back better, don't we? So we are going to get into some kind of new normal, and everybody keeps talking about the new normal. I think we have an opportunity now to begin to rebuild in a way which is much more environmentally sustainable than was the case before. And one of the things I think we have to remember in all of this is we've done a lot of work in terms of heavy trucking, and in a sense what we've been able to do is to decouple emissions on heavy trucking from economic growth. The bit that we've really struggled with is the kind of last mile city logistics, and a lot of our work, and it's not surprising given that my university is based in the middle of Birmingham, the second most populous city in the UK. We know that a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, comes from that last mile. So we see more and more urbanisation, more and more people living in urban areas. Online shopping has been given another boost by the pandemic. We have a massive problem with diesel-powered vans in urban areas. And a lot of our work is around what can we do sensibly about this to give us a cleaner environment in terms of pollution, a quieter environment because noise is a serious challenge, as well as trying to do something which is more environmentally sustainable. So the building back better and more sustainably in a city environment. Here in Dublin, we have some really good examples of sort of pilots which are being done, which offer enormous potential in terms of a different type of city life. And a lot of our focus in city sort of planning has been from a transport point of view, has been very much about passenger transport. But I'm seeing a discernible shift now away from that, not away from that, but about combining that with the recognition that you've got to think about the parcels and the freight movements that happen around urban areas.
In the early days of the pandemic, before it really hit Ireland, the main conversation was about the supply chain. And I'm sure, as you say, you were glad that in one way you were in focus. However, certainly some companies were for the first time realising how maybe exposed they were to issues in China. Some companies didn't even know really that they had issues with their supply chain. There's been a move then towards local sourcing. There's certainly talk about it. There's geopolitical issues affecting supply chains. Do you think ultimately we're going to move towards moving back from that global supply planning that we've been doing over the last number of decades and moving more towards sourcing goods and supplies nearer to home?
I think it's a complex picture. There isn't a short answer to your question. Going back to the premise upon which your question is based, we had a very interesting case in Birmingham, which was covered widely in the media, which involved Jaguar Land Rover executives flying parts back in their suitcases from China, you know, just to keep their supply.
Very hands-on.
Yeah, and it was interesting because that captured media attention, but for people who don't work in supply chains, it made them realise, oh yes, we are incredibly heavily dependent upon the world's factory in China across all kinds of sectors. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think the question's a bigger question perhaps than one that's purely about geography, because I think the biggest single lesson we've learned from the pandemic is that one size does not fit all when it comes to supply chains. So we've had this sort of inexorable move towards just-in-time type supply chains focused on lean methods, where everything is about the elimination of waste and the elimination of so-called non-value-adding activity. And that's great in certain industries, and we've got some very finely tuned just-in-time supply chains which work extraordinarily well. However, if we look at the crisis that we saw, for example, when it came to PPE in health service environments, a lot of those medical supply chains were trying to operate just-in-time and lean principles, and they're just wholly inappropriate. They probably need supply chain models which are much more about determining in a sensible, informed way where strategic stock holding should happen.
This is a move from just-in-time to just-in-case.
Just in case,
and
yeah,
you know, you've got you know, a great Irish family-owned company called Port West, Harry Hughes and his family in Westport, making world-class PPE and related equipment, originally making effectively boilers, in fact originally making gabardine coats for guards at the foundation of the state, now one of the world's leading suppliers of industrial protective equipment for oil wells in the China Sea. Along comes COVID. The company can flip locally very fast and say, this is what the market needs us to do now, what the people need from us now, and it's become a leading supplier into Britain of PPE on a just-in-case basis rather than a just-in-time basis. This is the emphasis that we need to get back to, is to say it doesn't have to come from the cheapest, regardless of standards, supply chain partner. The conurbation of these two islands offers huge potential for catering for a very substantial market, which the Ireland wing of gives access to another 500 million people in the European Union.
Can I just coming in on that? I mean, it's interesting to me because the phrase "just in case," I think until the pandemic was often used in a somewhat pejorative way.
Yes.
Like, you know, that company has a just-in-case supply chain, what are they doing wrong kind of thing. So, but I think but it's fundamentally about saying different types of markets, different types of products require different approaches. And some of that's about geography, going back to your original question. We've seen some evidence of nearshoring, you know, reshoring, near sourcing, and a whole new vocabulary is built up around this. I think, again, you've got to look at the wider picture here, because I've been working in supply chains for about 30 years now, and during that period, until relatively recently, we've seen this kind of apparently inexorable reduction in the barriers to the movement of products, people, knowledge, information, money, and so on across international borders, and the attendant sort of phenomenon of globalization. We've seen that slow down a bit in recent years. The tension between the United States and China is probably the biggest single driver of that. Brexit is part of that mix, because it does put up barriers again when we become used to barriers being removed. And we see other examples of this in different parts of the world. And I think the COVID crisis has forced companies to go back and reimagine their supply chains, and often face up to the very horrible reality that they didn't really understand what their supply chain looked like beyond the immediate touch points upstream and downstream. So we've done a lot of work, for example, on helping Midlands-based, UK Midlands-based companies in the food and drink supply chain to develop a profile, a detailed map of the flows across the region and from the region to the bigger outside world. And that's been revelatory for a lot of those businesses. They simply didn't know much about what went on in the supply chain beyond that immediate part, which they dealt with day to day. Now, if you're serious about building a more resilient supply chain architecture, you have to know what your current state is before you can move on. Yes. So I think there's a serious lack of sort of knowledge of that, and we've got to fill that gap if we are to have a fighting chance of moving forward.
It's been a difficult few months for the country, for the world, for business, for individuals. We want to have something positive to finish this conversation on. Seismic events do present opportunities. So talk to me a bit about where the opportunities lie.
Well, look, this situation is the crisis that should not be wasted. And business and entrepreneurs, many of them family-owned Indigenous businesses, know exactly what to do when the customer says, I'm in trouble. And the customers have been in trouble over the last while. And you know, at a national level, the only recovery we can look forward to pay for the cost of COVID, in financial terms 30 billion, in other terms far more, the only way we can recover that is through a jobs-led recovery. And the only way a jobs-led recovery is going to come, given that the public sector is not going to grow those jobs, because they didn't lose the jobs, it is the private sector. It's typically Indigenous Irish firms, more so now than FDIs. Because while the foreign direct investment sector has done us very well, the reality now is Twitter is telling people you don't need to come to Ireland to work anymore. You can work from wherever you are. Yes. So 40% of the tech population in Dublin are guests of the country in a wonderful way. They may not come back. Indigenous Irish firms have both the opportunity and the responsibility, and they need the policy framework and the budgetary framework to reinstate jobs and to grow further. And you know what? There are lots of jobs can be created now, because the UK, instead of maybe sourcing from other markets, now may source from Ireland as its nearest nearshore partner. And for Irish firms to assist the situation that British firms in the Midlands and elsewhere are now in a situation where they need access to the 500 million EU market. They could do that not by closing in Britain, but by opening additionally or creating alliances with Irish firms. And there are many more stories about how that can be taken forward. So this is filled with opportunity.
Okay. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. The RDS Vision 2030 series is made possible by the support of RDS members. For more details on how to join and support the work of the Society, visit rds.ie. Please subscribe to this channel for details of upcoming events in the series.